Okay, I'm going to move on from the point that I was trying to make, and I think it was simply this, is when there's controversy around the validity of a diagnosis to begin with, and then the manner in which that diagnosis is provided as a variable that's being investigated, that if there's real methodological concerns with being able to draw any conclusions because it's difficult to ascertain whether that person legitimately even has those symptoms because you have no way of being able to reference that other than case reports from somebody else, which is highly biased, right? We're talking about, I think it's overwhelmingly news media and reports from law enforcement, correct?
It's exclusively media, law enforcement, and court records, exclusively, of course.
Okay, yeah. So there's challenges, with methodology to be able to come to those conclusions at all.
But that's a problem in all no research has 100% accurate, valid. There's no such thing.
Well, that's what science is, a search for truth. But when
Exactly.
when your scientific experiment is set up with so many flaws, it's even less likely that you'll be able to obtain any legitimate data.
Yeah, but we're again, we deal with this by using comparison groups that deals with bias and confounding. We deal with this by examining multiple variables over time. So again, we look at things like we look at the data in different ways, temporality and specificity, all these sorts of things. And again,
Doc, I know you don't have to go through that again, but it always starts with a foundation. Is you have to have an established construct, right? You have to have that's got to be observable, that has to be measurable, and that data has to be collected in a way that allows for us to try to confirm that to the best that we can, right? So if we're gonna measure the presence of a virus, right? We need to be able to observe that virus. We have to be able to measure that virus, and then we'd have to be able to compare it to someone who doesn't have a virus, for example. That already is not occurring when you're slapping on a diagnosis and broadly saying it's mental illness, because you can choose anything to be mental illness then. When 40% of the American public can be identified as having mental illness at any time, that broad category allows an umbrella term for you to say anything with subjectivity is a mental illness, and then look at a comparison group and say, well, I'm going to choose not to provide a diagnosis there, even though you may not have enough evidence to be able to do that. Is that fair?
Well, I hear what you're saying. I will address this point. So I just want to make sure we don't conflate the two issues. One is the limitations of the research. I understand you're talking about the validity of psychiatric conditions. I want to address that. That is the second point, though. We've discussed the validity of the research itself, the limitations, bias, and all those sorts of things, so I won't mention that again. So yes, now definitely let's get to validity of psychiatric diagnoses. We kind of mentioned the DSM, that they compared the gold standard with the criteria. This was the point of the field trials. And they determined things like sensitivity, specificity, negative, positive predictive value. They would determine these statistical parameters, and usually they're in the 80% range, which is considered acceptable.
You believe psychiatric diagnoses are scientifically valid constructs?
Definitely. So, and this is the point I want to get to. I understand we need to discuss this. This is the point I want to get to. So that's just the DSM. So generally, a diagnostic measure is considered relatively valid or clinically useful when it gets to about 80% in terms of sensitivity, specificity. So that's
I argue against that. That's ever been achieved with a psychiatric diagnosis.
Well, I hear it, and that's what we're going to discuss for sure. I hear you, definitely. No, I appreciate the back and forth, and that we get to discuss these important issues. But that's just in general. 80% is about kind of the criterion or line we use in all of medicine to determine when a diagnostic test in particular is considered, valuable or not.
Then let me challenge you on that. So, what is the diagnostic test that allows you to observe that in bipolar II disorder?
What's
the test? What's the how is that evaluated? How is bipolar II a valid construct? Like, so how will a physician be able to take the time to be able to observe, evaluate, and identify that with accuracy?
Sure. Oh, well, I'm referring to the DSM criteria. So now I'm just referring to
So
the
do you see how
DSM
circular
criteria.
this gets? It becomes circular reasoning, right? You end up saying, well, a psychiatric condition is valid. Why? Because the DSM exists.
But the DSM is based on something else. It's based on a gold standard, and that's how they identify.
You believe that? You believe the way that the DSM is constructed is gold standard science. Be honest. There's a lot of people listening.
Definitely.
Because I think a lot of the people who actually were chair people of the DSM across very different, all of the different editions would clearly argue against that. Like Alan Francis, for example,
that the DSM is valid?
Scientifically valid. It was never meant to be that. It was never meant to be the identification of clear, identifiable, discrete medical conditions. It was always an attempt to try to the best of their ability, and they failed horribly, to try to cluster symptoms together for the purpose of research, classification, and communication. And so it's not explanatory. Like, someone has bipolar disorder, no one can say why they have bipolar disorder. Someone's depressed, the diagnostic criteria for major depressive disorder doesn't say why that person is depressed. It's just a label, and it's poorly constructed label.